Hi there, my name is Bob Naismith. I am a, a figure sculptor. I've been doing it for probably 50 years, which is a crazy thing to say, but yeah, it doesn't seem like 50 years, I'll tell you. I've been doing it for a long time, for about 6 or 7 of those years, which is quite small. I worked for Games Workshop. At the time, they were called Citadel Miniatures, or the section I worked for was called Citadel Miniatures. And we made all sorts of fun stuff. At that time, the whole the game thing was being developed. Warhammer 40,000 was being developed, hadn't been there before. Originally, it was called Rogue Trader. We did all sorts of fantastic, fun things with guys like Rick Priestley, Richard Halliwell, Jervis, John Stallard, lots of really fun play testing on, I think it was John Stallard's carpet floor in his front room, play testing the first set of rules that Rick came up with. Yeah, I've really fond memories of that. One of the memories of sculpting the Space Marines was how we collaborated, and by we I mean a group of the figure sculptors, the designers. Up to that point, and probably since then, individual sculptors have been working on individual projects. A set of figures, it might be Space Marines, might be elves, might be dwarves, might be citizens or monsters. But in the case of the plastic Space Marines, we decided to do it as a group. So it was myself, the twins, Alan and Michael Perry, Jez Goodwin and Ali Morrison. And so there were 5 of us, and we had a fantastic, probably about a week, maybe a week and a bit, designing these Space Marines, which were based upon the early Space Marines that I made for metal. Again, what happened there was, we knew we were pushing to make science fiction. I was really keen on science fiction, always have been. The idea came that I should speak to Rick, who was developing Rogue Trader, already had an idea for what the Space Marines were all about, described them to me. We talked about them for probably about 20 minutes, half an hour, and then he said, right, off you go and have a go at making some. So that's what I did, and I made, I think the first one was the one that became the limited edition Space Marine, which was the guy kind of advancing, holding a strange weapon, unlike the bolt gun. That was the first one. That one went down well, everybody liked that. So then on the back of that, I made probably about half a dozen or a dozen more Metal Masters of Space Marines, just so that we could get some on the table, start playing with them, start painting them. And at that point then, Brian Ansell, who was in charge of the whole thing, said we're contemplating making a plastic set. Up until then, we'd done quite a lot of plastic with fantasy. We'd done skeleton sets, dwarf sets, etc., etc. But this was going to be our first science fiction one. So at that time, the technology was really quite hokey, in the sense that we sculpted the models out of a brown wax-based clay called Chevant styling clay, which was used by the car industry for creating their original masters for cars in those days. What they would do is the model makers at Ford would bring in a big steel chassis. They would put about, I don't know, 2 or 3 tons of this clay onto the steel chassis and just start carving it and making the shape of, I don't know, a Ford Escort or a Ford Capri or something. And they would bring this clay up to a fabulous finish. And this was the stuff that we used, because that was what the pattern makers, who were the next stage in plastic injection tooling, needed. But the downside of this blooming clay was it never ever went hard. So you could never make a model and know that it would stay in that state unless you protected it from any interference whatsoever, which was fine until you would give it to one of our line managers to check, and they would pick it up and they would fiddle with it and they'd put thumbprints on it, and a really nice edge that you'd made would just suddenly be very, very soft and round because they'd pressed it with their fingers, and then we'd have to revisit that. So that was a wee bit frustrating, but we managed it, and at that time that was the only thing we knew. So we made those Space Marines. It was a group effort. So although I was involved there and I was nominally in charge of the group, there was a lot of input from the others. Everyone brought their own ideas to the table. Jez was instrumental, particularly in proposing the designs for the bolt gun and the design for the missile launcher, as I recall, the shoulder-mounted missile launcher. And in a sense, Jez is the one who's probably, in my view anyway, taken the Space Marines forward. So if you think of me as the guy who made the Model T Ford of Space Marines, then you've got to say that everything that happened after I left and the making of them into the, I don't know, the Bugatti Veyron of cars was really fundamentally, I think, driven by Jez. You know, his graphic line and his design potential were kind of realised in that, you know, and made the Space Marines pretty much what they are today. So, as I say, I was there for 6 years. I had a great time, thoroughly enjoyed it, made lots of other interesting and exciting things, got involved in the process of how plastic injection tools were made, and liaised with tool makers and pattern makers in this country for the most part. By this country, I mean the UK. And had a great time. I left Games Workshop at the very end of 1989, I believe. So January the 1st was my first day as a freelance. And I just count myself lucky. I'm one of these people who started off doing a hobby, which became a job. And it's gradually turning back into a hobby again. I enjoy everything I do now. I still freelance, so if there's anybody out there who wants anything made, give me a shout. I still love doing stuff. I do a lot of things now digitally on the computer, using three-dimensional design CAD packages like ZBrush and Sculpt by Geomagic. They're my two main tools of preference. I might use Blender every now and then, because they've all got little tricks that they can do better than everyone else. So you can take a file out of one package, import it into another, fiddle with it a bit, let it do its good work there, and then export it and put it back into the first package again. And I quite like that, and it's clean. And for someone of my age, remember the 50 years, my eyes aren't what they were. So what I do is I capitalise on that, because you can zoom in on things. You know, I do have various magnifying devices for my natural eyes that I use when I'm sculpting, because I do the real world sculpting as well. Just less of it now. You know, I mean, I think 20, 30 years ago, entry-level, small model soldier producers, whether they were sci-fi or fantasy or history, they had a kind of fundamental distrust of digital techniques. But now that they've seen how amazing it can be and how it can really smooth the timeline and give them access to properties to start selling the object, very often before it's even made. You know, with a 3D image, you can render it and make it look as real as you need to communicate with the customers. That's you guys. So I just think that I count myself a very lucky person to be working like this. I've worked for many companies. I worked for Bluebird. I worked for Corgi, making drivers for cars and designs for cars. I worked for Hasbro, made some bits for Cindy. Don't tell anyone. What else did I do? I did work for Bluebird. I made some cricket figures. You may have played the Bluebird tabletop cricket game. That was me. I did some resculpts for Corgi. They were reissuing the Chitty Chitty Bang Bang car. Oh, and this was about 25 years ago. And they'd lost the original patterns for the little figures that sit in it. So Muggins here said, "Oh, I'll do that." So I went off and made those. Yeah, so lots of fun stuff, lots of great sci-fi stuff. Made spaceships for people. I've made real-world naval wargaming ships for a company called Navwar, and we made them in nominally 1/1200th and 1/3000th scale. I made every class of the Fletcher class destroyer, of which there are, I think, 37. I made all of those, and that drove me batty for a while, as well as all like the capital ships, major ships, Japanese, Americans, British, French, you name it. So that was good fun. Also in the early days, before I worked for Games Workshop, I was involved in a small company called Naismith Design, and we made, what did we make? We made Inca and Aztec and Mayan figures, as well as making English Civil War, Sudanese, Napoleonics, American Civil War, English Civil War. Obviously, you can tell mostly historical, because that was the bent then. There wasn't such a demand for sci-fi, for which I suppose you have to thank Games Workshop. You know, the other thing that I find that's happening is that our experience now of gaming is driven not only by the models that we buy and paint and play with on the table, but by the imagery that surrounds them, the imagery in the books, on the websites, in movies that we watch, in basically all the other things we experience. And for that reason, I think that the figures are becoming more of a part of the whole rather than the thing itself, so that, you know, when you make a model Space Marine now, in your mind you don't just have that little figure to look at. You've got all the imagery and all the animations that are kicking off around in the world of online that you can see.
It's almost like a lot more refined these days, I would say, as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think back when you did the very first ones, maybe it was a bit more freer as to how you could interpret what a Space Marine might look like.
Yes.
Obviously, you had the initial conversations with Rick Priestley.
Mm-hmm.
Would John Sibbick been involved in
John, that? not so much directly with the actual overall design and the strategy of the design, but I take your point, and you're absolutely right, that at the outset we lived in a world where pretty much anything goes. If we wanted to make strange aliens with funny heads or multiple arms, the guys at Games Workshop Citadel were only too keen to see that. But then as the company grew, as its kind of strategy was implemented for selling Warhammer 40,000, it was clear that the Space Marine was going to be the seminal object, and therefore there was a degree of order and rigour that came in, which frankly I'm glad I wasn't there for, because that's not the kind of person I am. The main reason I'm a freelance is because I didn't want to be a part of that machine that would create this highly toned, highly polished object. You know, I quite like things that have got flaws in them. I like things where lines are not straight. They might look straight, but they're not. I like things that have got a little bit of humanity in them. And of course, the very thing about Space Marines is they are more than human. So I applaud them for everything they have done. and they've helped so many of the other companies which are spin-offs, people who used to work at Games Workshop, who decided to have a go at things themselves. So these smaller companies have all benefited because Games Workshop implemented a higher level of finish and a higher level of design criteria and production criteria that the smaller companies could safely replicate underneath, knowing that because the main competitor, i.e. Games Workshop, was creating this marvellous stuff, you had to try to make that, and people were prepared to pay the money that was necessary to get models like that. So it meant that smaller companies like like Warlord, like Mantic, like many of the other companies across the globe now, in a sense, they've all got to kind of tip their hat a little bit to the success that Games Workshop's enjoyed, because we've been able to kind of come in its wake and create lots of other things that maybe Workshop would like to do, but they don't really. They're a kind of behemoth, you know. They're a giant ship in the ocean that cannot steer nimbly anymore, whereas all these other smaller companies are like on little fast rubber inflatables that can dodge about, and they can, you know, they can make things on the hoof. And Workshop, bless them, I don't think that they've got the ability now to do that, which is great, because it means we've got this fantastic thing in the middle sailing, you know, benignly across the oceans, and then all these other little companies, and every now and then one of these little companies makes something which is exciting and new and innovative, but it's done partly because they can enjoy the support that they get from this huge fan base that Workshop's got. So yeah, so basically this is a great hobby to be involved in. I still enjoy it very much indeed. I might start going to some shows. I don't like really going to shows. It's very tiring. You're standing on your feet all day long. And talking to people all day long can be exhausting. You know, it's like being at a party that lasts for 24 hours. So yeah, I enjoy it. Maybe I'll see you at one of these shows when I get there. And if you remind me that you watched this thing, then you can always say, I remember you making this little video in 2024, and I have an issue to raise with you. So please feel free to come up and speak to me and raise the issue. Okay, all the best now.